This is the Energy Makers Show, featuring the innovators, financiers, and policymakers focused on the global energy demand. Brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And here's your host, Russ Capper.
Hi, I'm Russ Capper, and welcome to another episode of the Energy Makers Show. Today, Dr. Kenneth Medlock III, the Energy and Resource Economics Fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute. And we're going to get his perspective on the transformation of energy resources in the United States and his 4-point 2013 energy policy recommendations for the Obama administration. All of that right after this.
At BKD, we understand the constantly shifting nature of the energy industry. As a national CPA and advisory firm, we serve energy clients from the beginning to the end of the cycle. Our experienced energy advisors serve approximately 300 energy companies in exploration, midstream, downstream, oilfield services, and power production. Plus, we're the largest North American member of the Praxity Global Alliance, which means we can help you wherever you operate. Contact a BKD advisor or visit us online to learn more.
This is the Energy Makers Show, brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And now, back to the Energy Makers Show with your host, Russ Capper.
Hi, I'm Russ Capper, and welcome back to the Energy Makers Show, coming to you today from the Baker Institute from the campus of Rice University, where my guest is Dr. Kenneth Medlock III, the James A. Baker III and Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics at the Baker Institute. He also happens to be the Senior Director of the Center for Energy Studies, as well as an adjunct professor and lecturer in the Department of Economics at Rice University. Ken, welcome to the Energy Maker Show.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Well, let's start at the top. Let's hear your words on the tremendous transformation of the energy resources here now in the United States.
It's a massive transformation, to say the least. If you think back just 10 years ago, we were talking about importing a lot of natural gas into this country in the form of liquefied natural gas from places as far away as the Middle East, Australia, West Africa. And in just a little more than a decade, we're now talking about exporting natural gas. And of course, the technologies that were used in the upstream, in the field, to make all of this a reality have also migrated into the oil sector. And now we're seeing discussions begin to emerge about potentially exporting crude oil from the United States long term. As a matter of fact, there are some projections that show the U.S. within the next decade becoming one of the largest crude oil producers in the entire world. So it really has been nothing short of transformative. Now, how did it happen? It's a little different than sort of things of the past, if you will. A lot of times people like to think back to the 1980s when the North Sea really started to come into its own. First production came on in the mid-'70s, but it really started to grow then. And that was a transformative event for global oil markets. But in this case, you're talking about a resource that geologists have known about for a long time. It really was always just an issue of technology. How do we make it technically and commercially feasible? Thanks to some innovations that really owe their roots to some things that were done during a Carter administration program called the Eastern Gas Shales Project, migrating on into the private sector, and then eventually George Mitchell taking them into the field. We are where we are today. And that's the remarkable thing about energy and transformations in general. Anytime you can remove the geologic uncertainty to an extent and really boil it down to technology, the entire question is entirely different, right? It really is about how do we make it work? It becomes a scientific issue rather than an issue of uncertainty.
Right. Well, I know from looking into your background and many of the things that you've written about, you must have anticipated this fairly early on.
Well, anticipated slightly. I wouldn't want to jump too far into that pool, but because it did catch me by surprise. I was involved in one of the very first assessments of shale gas resources in North America that was done back in 2006, 2007. My job in that work was to actually review the literature on the resource in place. And this is where I started looking at PhD dissertations that were written by geologists at Penn State University talking about the Marcellus Shale back in the late 60s, right? Wow. And when you start to look at that, it's sort of like a slap in the face because you realize this is just an issue of technology. right? And we start to see some of these technologies mature, and lo and behold, you start to realize there's a lot more than just the Barnett Shale out there, which is where Mitchell started this whole revolution, if you will.
Right.
And once that came into view for me, it really was a simple matter of incorporating those data points into the work we were doing here at the Baker Institute and beginning to come up with alternative viewpoints that were a little bit against the grain back in 06 and 07, but turned out to be pretty much correct.
Well, Dr. Michael Economides on the show was talking about how, hey, we were doing hydraulic fracturing in 1949, but it's the combination of that along with horizontal drilling that became very effective. And you're saying that George Mitchell was the first to kind of put those together in the field?
It's a very good point. The first commercial hydrofrac was done by Halliburton back in 1949. Okay. And there have been over 1 million wells hydraulically fractured. As a matter of fact, the technique is used in some applications to drill water wells. It's a stimulation technique, right? Increase flow, in effect, to the wellbore. And then horizontal drilling was not new either, right? I mean, we've been directional drilling and then horizontal drilling. So when you think about combining two technologies, it's sort of like a process innovation, kind of like what the assembly line did for Ford, right? Made things a lot more commercial, a lot cheaper to do, and a lot more effective. And so you really are just talking about something that raised well productivity, because if you just drill into a shale without doing both, both hydraulically fracturing and horizontal drilling into the formation, you end up with very little flow, and so it's a very expensive endeavor. So using the two together really just changed everything. A
potential obstacle or friction in the future of the combination of these two technologies is the government study on the harm done to water based on hydraulic fracturing. And when you hear that, from the government side, it sounds pretty risky. When you hear it from the industry side, it sounds real clean. We've really, never had a problem. It almost looks like, too, with the momentum going now, it would be hard to stop. But what do you see the future of that issue?
The initial concern, this is why EPA launched a study, was what does hydraulic fracturing, what risks does it pose to the water table? Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of concern naturally, because you're talking about reservoirs that provide drinking water for, a large portion of the nation's population. Mm-hmm. What if you contaminate it? I mean, that would be devastating. Right. And so those studies were initiated, but when you sort of look at the evidence, the body of evidence, there's really not any that suggests that hydraulic fracturing is an issue. Drilling is an industrial process, so you have to be certain that you're using all the proper materials and techniques so that your casings don't fail. Right. Because casing failures ultimately is where you end up with that potential problem. Right. Most of the risks related to water contamination, quite frankly, are above ground. They're not really in the drilling process, so to speak. So when you're in places like Pennsylvania, and this is where you heard about some of the initial concerns really arising, where they weren't really equipped to deal with the rush that occurred back beginning in 2008, 2009 into the Marcellus. As a matter of fact, there's only 2 water processing facilities that are rated to handle produced water in the entire state. And so what that means is you're drilling these wells and you're bringing this flow back as you're digging retention pits, and you're putting this toxic water in these pits, and that's where you run into potential problems. So it really is just an issue of making sure that the infrastructure is in place to be able to handle this water so that it can be properly treated and disposed of. And companies are taking some steps to do that on their own in terms of developing recycling technologies. And then regulatory bodies are doing the same. In Pennsylvania, they actually instituted a small tax on producers so that they could actually staff up to deal with the influx of activity because they just weren't ready for it. So, in some ways you could view that as industry getting out a little bit in front of the regulatory infrastructure, but at the end of the day, it's all correctable. And we've seen tremendous success now in the Marcellus. It's the largest producing basin in North America today for natural gas. Right.
So when you say correctable, it makes me think of the challenge and almost the sub-industry that you see developing now in the water area, just moving it around and cleaning it. Do you see that not to be a problem for the future?
No, I don't, actually, because really what you're talking about is an issue of infrastructure and technology. Okay. And this goes back to the point I made about drilling wells, right? Okay. If you can boil it down to technology, then the problem becomes infinitely different because we can solve those problems. As a matter of fact, we've had a long history of solving those problems.
Right.
On the infrastructure side, it really is just about development, and making sure the proper mechanisms are in place to ensure that development occurs the right way.
Okay, so moving away from technology briefly, I certainly understand your background and your in-depth focus on economics and the economy in general. I often contend that too many people in our country don't understand the way that energy production affects the overall economy and the growth of the economy. I think it's critical. Share your perspective on that.
I have a colleague here at Rice who is a macroeconomist by training, and he put it very well. A lot of the sort of broad macroeconomic thinking really didn't incorporate energy into the modeling work that was going on to inform policy, to inform things like more generally tax policy and monetary policy, things of this nature. But when you think about why that is, it's because generally energy, in terms of its share of GDP, gross domestic product, or the economy, if you will, it's 3 to 4%, right? So it's a pretty small fraction.
Right.
So a lot of times it's just arbitrarily dismissed as being too small to matter. But at the end of the day, if you don't have energy, everything shuts down, right? So it's infinitely more important than just its share of GDP. So he really got interested in energy because he wanted to incorporate that facet into macroeconomic modeling. And in a lot of ways, the fact that there's been this tremendous amount of thinking that's gone on in the macroeconomic sort of frameworks that has ignored energy sort of really tells you a lot about why the general public may not really fully appreciate its value, if you will. But it certainly is important. And of course, there's a lot of work that's gone on looking at the effect of energy prices on economic activity because it affects consumer budgets. And so that's where you get cycle back into the production aspect, right? Because ultimately, when prices rise, it should signal investment opportunities so that you actually see new production coming online and supplies come up, and that will tend to keep prices from rising anymore at the very least, maybe even fall. So all of those things matter for a variety of reasons. On the production side, it is economic activity. It's an industrial activity, so it provides jobs. It creates economic opportunities in areas. I mean, you look at Pennsylvania, you look at West Texas, you look at South Texas. There's a lot of areas now that coming out of 2008 were in the doldrums that are boom towns, right? And all that owes itself to what's happening on the energy production side. And then, of course, it's bringing new supply to market. It's creating up other opportunities. It's keeping a lid on energy prices. Of course, natural gas prices in North America are very, very low relative to the rest of the world, which is triggering a lot of activity in terms of industrial expansion. Right. And that, of course, creates jobs and creates economic opportunities, creates opportunities to shift the balance of trade in this country so that the dollar has a different standing relative to other currencies. And so all these knock-on effects, right, which are kind of hard to quantify, to be honest.
Other than they're huge.
No, that's exactly right. And I think it's one of those experiments that you don't really know until you know, right, what the full impact is. But I think most people who are on the ground today, and particularly in the areas where you're seeing a lot of this development occur, they fully appreciate what's happening because their livelihoods are changed dramatically as a result of it.
Absolutely. All right, and we'll be back with more with Dr. Ken Medlock from the Baker Institute at Rice University after this. This is the Energy Makers Show, seen online at TheEnergyMakers.com.
Welcome to another episode of The Future of Water and Unconventionals, brought to you by IHS and CAP Resources.
Hello, I'm Aaron Horn with CAP Resources.
And I'm Sarah Fletcher with IHS.
Today we're discussing regulatory trends regarding water management and unconventional resources.
I think regulation in the oil and gas industry is rapidly evolving and a very interesting topic. And you'll see that most of the changes are happening at the state level, but there are also a lot of federal environmental regulations that can come into play. And there's a lot of discussion about who should be regulating and also who can be regulating, and also a lot of regulations, some of which are proactive for some of the environmental topics and also reactive to operational changes that we're seeing.
There are two states that have passed legislation or regulatory oversight that sort of speak to the future of what regulatory oversight can be in unconventionals. And the first is Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania right now, operators report the wastewater that they generate and where that wastewater goes. It's a self-reporting process. It's not perfect yet, but it is a step change from where other states have been previously. The second is Texas. And in Texas right now, legislators are trying to pass bills that would encourage operators to recycle water. And they're taking that approach through various methodologies. But a few of them look like they're going to pass, and that's going to help operators recycle water and conserve water as a precious resource that it is.
I think that's right, Aaron, and I think we'll see other states follow in the lead that Texas and Pennsylvania has taken on this important issue.
So the regulatory environment regarding water management continues to change. Check back for more on water management and market opportunities.
And for more information on water management strategies and water market opportunities in the continental U.S., go to ihs.com/waterunconventionals. This is the Energy Makers Show, brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And now back to the Energy Makers Show with your host, Russ Capper.
All right, continuing on with Dr. Ken Medlock at Rice University's Baker Institute. Well, Ken, in your works, I came across a recommendation that you sent to the present administration about what you think that you would suggest they do in the category of energy for the future in the United States. Share those recommendations with us.
Sure. There were 4 principal recommendations that were made. There's a lot of other things that we could talk about, but I tried to focus really more heavily on the transformation that's going on right now, and how to help facilitate further growth, but in a safe and responsible, sustainable manner, right? To use the buzzword.
Right.
So, one of those ideas is to actually think about instituting very transparent tax policies, but it's not to burden the industry, right? That's where sometimes you hear the word tax and immediately the word burden comes out next, right? But it's really to make sure that the appropriate regulatory oversight is in place. And that requires money, right? It requires funding. And so why do you need that appropriate oversight? Well, because the last thing you need, particularly for your industry, is a major accident, right? Because then that will shift public opinion. It will dramatically change the entire landscape. And then you might then at that point get knee-jerk reactions on the policy side. So it really is about promoting, a institutional framework, a regulatory framework that really makes sure that this is done safely and properly.
And you got a specific tax amount suggestion?
Yeah, it was on the order of 1% of production of the production take, so revenues, right? So it's like a royalty scheme, basically.
Okay.
In effect, what you do is you earmark that particular tax quantity, if you will, for regulatory oversight.
And did you get reaction from the industry on that suggestion?
I did not.
Yeah.
I think in general, most in the industry would tell you as long as they know what the tax burden is, as long as they are sure that the regulatory frameworks will not change, there's an element of certainty and they can operate just fine, right? I think the biggest issue is the elements of uncertainty. And right now, the administration in particular with all the studies that are ongoing and the potential new rulings that might come down, that's a big cloud of uncertainty. And you might say, well, it hasn't affected what's happening. Well, you don't know that unless you can do the counterfactual, right? So, but in general, it is a classic investment under uncertainty kind of framework. You want to have the most certainty you can so you can eliminate those issues that might impede investment opportunity.
Okay. And in the category of regulations, isn't there sort of a debate, particularly as it pertains to the impact of hydraulic fracturing, between whether or not state regulation can do that better than federal regulation?
Yes. There is a constituency that would like to see everything done at the federal level, just as there is a massive constituency that would like to see everything remain at the state level. I think in terms of oversight that's directly pertains to drilling activities in particular regionalities, localities. It's probably better in the hands of state regulators simply because There is an infrastructure in place to actually go out and monitor well sites, to do inspections, on-site inspections, to have producers actually report on a regular basis what's happening at well sites. And quite frankly, state regulators understand the lay of the land a little bit better in their own backyards.
Sure.
And this ranges from dealing with the producers that are active in those states all the way to understanding the geology that the producers are active in. So, all of these things I think do sort of best reside in the hands of local regulators. Where you could possibly see some things on the federal side, which I think might be beneficial, really pertain to the area of transparency. So you might recall there was a big issue about what are the chemicals used in the hydraulic fracturing fluid? And this, of course, was a major concern because it contributed to concerns about contamination of groundwater. And that's where, quite frankly, it's just an issue of reporting what you're using. And in some states, you've seen some companies step up and champion some legislation that actually does promote some element of transparency. State of Texas, for example, that's already happened. But at the federal level, that still lacks. And I think that's where you could likely see something happen at the federal level that doesn't, it's not going to impede or impinge on anything that the state regulator would do, but it really will sort of set a bar. And quite frankly, transparency, which has been one of this administration's, chief points of advocacy, is something that makes people feel better, right? Because then they understand exactly what's going on.
Okay. So what's the second recommendation that you sent to the?
Well, the second recommendation really relates to concerns about pipeline infrastructure. One of the big issues around shale gas development in particular, and this of course matriculates into oil in a different way, which I'll get to, but is methane escape. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and of course that creates a lot of concern about expanded natural gas production and distribution. There are some studies ongoing. The Environmental Defense Fund is involved in a very exhaustive study looking at fugitive methane emissions at various points along the value chain. I was actually involved in some work where we were looking at what those methane emissions might be based on some mass balance kind of accounting. So this was actually prior to my coming to the Baker Institute, a private sector job that I held. And we were interested in this because we were obviously interested in understanding what the value proposition of distribution was. Well, one of the things that we came to understand was that a lot of the methane emissions that we could calculate or methane escape that we calculate was actually what we call behind the fence. So in local distribution company territory. It wasn't along the interstates. It wasn't at the wellhead. It wasn't at the gathering systems. It was behind the fence. What's the big difference there? It has to do with the regulatory framework governing the development of the infrastructure. Behind the fence, local distribution companies will develop infrastructure, maintain infrastructure based on a rate of return metric. So in other words, if they have, they see some need to do some work on their infrastructure, this is sink capital, they will actually have to file a rate case to get a return on all invested capital that will be pre-approved by some state governing body, state regulatory commission, whatever it happens to be, depends on where you are, Public Utilities Commission, whatever. But what that means is that you bring an element of politics into infrastructure development, right? When you're on the interstate system, it's a very different kind of process, right? As a matter of fact, the cost to maintain infrastructure is rolled into the rates, which are all pre-filed with the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, when the infrastructure is actually developed, right? So it's all sort of sunk, it's taken care of, and that's why you don't really see that many problems, quite frankly, on the interstate systems. When you get behind the fence, San Bruno, the big disaster that happened in PG&E, that's behind the fence infrastructure, right? When you look at some work that's been done at Duke University where they've actually looked at methane plumes in and around the city of Boston, they actually noticed that the methane plumes are quite large near sewers, where pipeline infrastructure will typically, particularly local distribution infrastructure, be laid. Right? And that's because it's old infrastructure, right? And so maintaining that and updating it is quite costly because you're talking about digging up roads in some cases, and it's going to be expensive. Of course, an LDC is typically going to get a return on any capital they invest to do that, right? Again, it gets into the element of politics. And so this is one of the recommendations that I had, right? change that institutional framework, because that's where the risks lie. And quite frankly, that's the most inappropriate place for them to lie, because you're talking about where people live, right? And a methane escape is not just bad for the environment, right? It's also bad because if you have enough methane accumulate and you have a spark, you get an incident like San Bruno, right, where people actually lose their lives. And so that's an immediate hazard. So that's one of the things that I've actually proposed be looked at in terms of a major overhaul ultimately, because at the end of the day, if you could allow some sort of market-based regulation to infiltrate that behind-the-fence infrastructure, then you might actually see more appropriate pricing, quite frankly, more appropriate upkeep of infrastructure, less issue with methane escape, which is, it's not a shale gas issue, it's a natural gas issue, right? And so it doesn't matter where the gas is coming from. If we were importing it as LNG, it'd have to get on the same infrastructure. So that's really the core of the issue. So it is about, looking at that institutional framework and thinking about ways to change it so that we can avoid the problems that exist with it today.
So what's next?
For some reason, we've gotten into this mode of picking winners, and this goes back prior to this administration, right? It spans multiple administrations. But what this means is effectively subsidizing particular types of energy choices. When you do that, you tilt the landscape in favor of those energy choices, and a lot of times that can be, quite frankly, arbitrary. What I recommended was to eliminate that practice and instead devote funding into basic R&D, research and development activities. There's a very simple premise as to why I said this. As a matter of fact, the shale revolution we'll be discussing owes its roots to basic R&D.
Right.
Back in the late 70s, there was concern that the United States was running out of natural gas, and of course we knew that there were resources locked up in these shales, and so the Eastern Gas Shales Project was initiated to try to understand how to get at these technically and commercially and make it feasible.
Right. And that was in the Jimmy Carter era.
That was during the Carter
Yeah.
administration. That's exactly right.
Right.
And then, of course, it migrated into the private sector and
Right.
ultimately proved itself.
Right.
And the interesting thing about that is it took 30 years.
Right.
Really to germinate, right? 25 to 30 years.
Right.
And so that's the thing about R&D that makes it politically difficult. You can devote a lot of funds to R&D, but you don't know if it's going to bear any fruit, and certainly it's not going to bear fruit in 2 or 4 or 6 years. That's the time frames our politicians tend to think in, right? So
time frame.
exactly,
Yeah, right.
and so you kind of have to take a risk, so to speak. But when those risks pay off, they pay off big, and we see that with shale right now. So, in terms of funding basic R&D, this is funding things like basic research into solar panels, basic research into nanotechnology applications in the energy field, basic research into wind technologies.
As opposed to investing in Solyndra.
As opposed to just arbitrarily
Companies,
funding a private enterprise there you're not really doing basic R&D, right? You're actually deploying.
Right.
And when you deploy, if those technologies aren't ready, ultimately all they do is raise the cost of energy to the consumer. So,
and to a lot of people, that's controversial, even if it's successful that you chose a winner. But boy, when you fail, it's even more controversial.
That's absolutely right. So, if you fund basic R&D instead of just arbitrarily subsidize certain energy choices, then the cream will rise to the top.
Absolutely.
That's really the point.
All right, cool. All right, so continue on with your recommendations. This is cool.
The last recommendation, which I think is really salient given the ongoing discussions at the national level, there have been multiple hearings at the Senate and now at the House level in the energy subcommittees about whether or not we should export natural gas, and this is beginning to matriculate into whether or not we should export oil.
Right.
So what do we do with this bounty, right? And there's where you have all the special interests sort of coming out and speaking their bit. There are some very large industrial users of natural gas that are ardently opposed to exporting LNG because they feel that's going to raise prices and eliminate their competitive advantage.
Right.
By the same token, it's about responsiveness, right? What form of demand is the most responsive, because producers are going to support that, because prices last April, right, hit $1.90, and that's very low.
Right.
And most producers can't make money at $1.90. So, so that's when you begin to see rigs close down, shut in or shut down, and drilling activity basically slow down to more or less a halt. So there's this happy medium, right? What do we do? And one of the things that I've advocated in the recommendations is to allow the market to work. Because if you get out of the way and allow the market to work, you're not creating constraints that at the end of the day could be arbitrary and really just support one particular avenue over another. So,
which means allow exporting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Allow exporting, allow industrial facilities to expand,
Right.
Allow power generation to continue to grow, use of natural gas, it's displacing coal. Of course, all of this is going to be sensitive to price.
Right.
Allow natural gas to migrate into the transportation system.
Right.
And when I say allow, it really is just about streamlining permitting processes, making sure that the market can actually respond the way the market wants to respond.
I sort of feel an advocacy for free enterprise coming through here at the Baker Institute on several of these.
There is an element of that, absolutely.
All right. All right, we'll be back with more with Ken Medlock from Rice University's Baker Institute after this.
Welcome to this edition of The Power of People, where we explore how to bring out the best in your most valuable asset. I'm Robin Knowles, President and CEO of TDS, the Workforce Performance Experts. Today we're talking with Randy Jensen about working with the younger generation and how they're just entering the workforce. Thanks for joining us, Randy.
Thanks for having me, Robin.
So Generation X, Millennials, what's up with all of the names?
We use labels such as Generation Y or Millennials, but what we're really talking about are the young workers who are entering the workforce today. And the problem is that many managers really don't understand the characteristics of that new generation that's coming into the workplace.
Well, one of the challenges I hear about is that this generation moves jobs quite frequently.
They do, but they also bring a lot of energy and excitement to the workplace. However, they tend to lack experience and change jobs maybe every 3 years or so.
So organizations have the task of providing their first experience and developing them only to lose them after 3 years. What can an organization do to retain those employees?
The young generation puts a high premium on education and continuing their education after graduation, which means an organization needs to make an investment in their training and learning. Those young people want opportunities for growth, and they want to know that they're being groomed for the future, so the organization needs to make that investment in their future. One of the pitfalls, though, is that oftentimes when people are trained, they're only trained to the task they need to perform for their job. And organizations are forgetting things such as soft skills training, which would be things like leadership, communication, teamwork, those sorts of things. We found that those organizations that do make that investment tend to develop better leaders and are better able to retain their best employees.
Absolutely. It seems necessary to give employees a path in the organization, or they'll look for a path somewhere else.
You know, not too long ago, when a person started at an organization, the assumption is they were there for the long haul. But really that doesn't happen now. People aren't staying with the same job for their whole career. And so the organization needs to show that they're making an investment in their employees, and when they do, those employees will then make an investment in that organization.
Well, thank you so much, Randy.
You're welcome.
This has been another edition of The Power of People. Join us again next time as we learn more about how you can develop excellence in your workplace while still getting the best possible ROI from your human capital.
This is the Energy Makers Show, brought to you by NRG, moving clean energy forward. And now back to the Energy Makers Show with your host, Russ Capper.
Okay, continuing on with Ken Medlock from Rice University's Baker Institute. So did you get a response from the Obama administration on your recommendations?
No. However, since those recommendations were submitted, I have been called up to testify at the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, primarily on the issue of LNG exports, because that's the issue that's very topical right now.
Okay.
But we are getting some traction, I think, in terms of the regulations that, or the recommendations we gave to the administration. As a matter of fact, you've seen some movement that's very similar to what's been recommended. In particular, on the let the market decide issue.
Right.
We actually have seen the second permit approved for construction and export of liquefied natural gas from the country down in Freeport. So
right. That's not the Cheniere one.
The Cheniere one's at Sabine Pass. That had actually received its permit to export a while ago. But my feeling is, particularly with the appointment of Ernie Moniz as the new Energy Secretary, he will keep his word and sort of do the due diligence and review the process, review the studies that have been done. But I actually think you'll begin to see those permits issued achieved much more quickly going
Great.
forward.
So before I let you go, Ken, one other sort of benefit that came along with the U.S.'s transformation of its energy resources is lower CO2 emissions, mainly because natural gas replacing coal had a huge positive impact. But in this whole category of CO2 emissions and man-made global warming, what is the position of the Baker Institute?
Generally, we've supported, through the studies we've done, because we were able to actually show economically that this was the most feasible path, market-oriented solutions. So this means rather than sort of cap and trade or outright quantity regulations, because that's effectively what a cap and trade type regulation is, more along the lines of a tax. Why do I say this? Well, 2012 is a great example. What you saw was natural gas prices dip to a point where they were very competitive with coal in the power generation sector. And you actually saw CO2 emissions in the United States for 2012 dip to the lowest they've been since the early 1990s. That's pretty remarkable.
It is.
And that was, quite frankly, simply because natural gas was displacing coal and power. So that price signal is very valuable. If you were to levy a tax, you get a certain amount of certainty, right, associated with the price of using a particular fuel. Whereas a cap and trade system, you don't really know because you don't really know what the price of the carbon permit will be at any given point in time. So there's a little bit more volatility associated with fuel choice there. There are ways to mitigate that, but quite frankly, a tax gives you an element of certainty. And going back to a point we raised a while ago in this conversation, right? Certainty is very valuable for, governing investment decisions. So the private sector, and I think you've seen this, quite frankly, in terms of the stuff that's come out from the private sector, is largely supportive of a tax policy instead of a quantity-oriented policy. And that's pretty much where we sit as well.
And that would be a tax based on
the amount of CO2 associated with the combustion of a particular fuel.
Right. Well, Ken, I really appreciate you sharing your perspective. I might want to come back out here and visit with you again at some point in time.
Sure. Love to have you.
You bet.
Thank you.
All right. And that wraps up my discussion with Dr. Kenneth Medlock III, who is the James A. Baker III and the Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics at Rice University's Baker Institute. And that wraps up this episode of The Energy Makers Show, heard on the radio and seen right here at TheEnergyMakers.com.